Our next speaker is well known to all of you and certainly well known to all of us at the River District. Eric is the general manager, Eric Kuhn, a position he's held since 1996. Eric this year is celebrating his 35th anniversary service to Western Slope, Western Colorado, and to the Colorado River District. Prior to working for the, thank you. Prior to working for the River District, he served as an engineer officer aboard nuclear submarines for the U.S. Navy and worked as a nuclear startup engineer for Bechtel Power Corporation. Please welcome Eric Kuhn.
Well, thank you, Chris, and I want to also take the time to thank the River District staff, Dave Kanzer and Lori and Denise and Sonia and everybody that's working on this. This is a all hands on deck effort, and we really enjoy it. And I want to thank you, the audience, for taking the time on a Friday to come down or to come over and spend a little time with us and have a broad-ranging discussion of the Colorado River issues, which is a lot of fun these days. My talk today is going to be to continue what we heard from Suzanne, Central Arizona Project, and put an Upper Basin perspective on what's going on in the basin, and take that Upper Basin perspective a little, divide it again, and talk a little bit about a Colorado perspective and how it fits in to the Colorado Water Plan and how it fits into our future here on the Colorado River Basin. As you can see up here, the Colorado River Basin is shown from a satellite's view. I guess I would say it's a bird's view from about 30,000 miles, actually more like 15,000 miles. And the Colorado River Basin, we know, is about 240,000 square miles. It's about the same as the Columbia River, except its natural flow at the mouth is somewhere around 16 million acre-feet. The natural flow of the Columbia, which also has a drainage area of about 250,000 square miles, is about 200 million acre-feet. The natural flow of the Illinois River and the Hudson River are in that same range in the teens as the Colorado River. So it's one of the great river systems of the nation. It drains approximately 1/12 of the continental 48 states. But what we have, what other basins have that we don't have as much of is actual precipitation. And we heard from Jeff Lucas on the impacts of warming temperatures. I think those will continue, whether you're one that believes that humans are causing temperatures to go up or it's natural. They're going up either way. And as temperatures go up, they will impact flows. And the conditions we've seen on the Colorado River, where every drop of water is used since 1998, are going to get more challenging. But I want to go on here. Let's see. Did that? Nope. Once you go to the next slide here, I guess I didn't. And here a little bit is the basin. Upper Basin, Lower Basin. I won't go into the details, although I think there's a couple important things on this slide. The first is the Colorado River is a regional resource. It's not just a resource. We talk about the Colorado River Basin, but what Albuquerque, Pueblo, Colorado Springs, Denver Metro, Cheyenne, Salt Lake City, and Los Angeles metro area, or the Southern California coastal plain, what all of those have in common is they use Colorado River water. So although Colorado drains 240,000 square miles, it serves a much greater area than that because it's a source of water that we export. We export it out of the headwaters of the San Juan into Santa Fe and Albuquerque. We export it out of the headwaters of the Colorado onto the Colorado Front Range. We export it out of the Little Snake River over into Wyoming, into Cheyenne, where it's exchanged for a water supply. We export it to the Wasatch Front through the Central Utah Project and other projects, and we export it to the Southern California coastal plain. So The river, what happens, as we heard last year from Pat Mulroy and others, what happens on the Rio Grande, which is seeing significantly low flows, what happens in California onto the Bay Delta, all impact the Colorado River. Now, let's go back to what Suzanne said. The CAP and the Lower Basin is looking at contingency planning. The Lower Basin is looking at conserving additional water, reducing their consumptive use to bring the reservoir systems into balance. The same thing is happening in the Upper Basin. It's coordinated, but we're in a little different situation. We're above the large reservoirs. Those two large reservoirs, of course, are Mead and Powell, and most of the Lower Basin is below those. So the situation, although we're connected by the river, our situation is a little different being above the reservoirs because we have to deal with hydrologic variability in a quicker, if you want to call it, manner, in a manner that, that we have to respond to a 2001 to 2004 period in a much more rapid way, or a 1977, or a 2012 and 2013. We have to be able to respond to it quicker because that hydrology hits us faster. They have the cushion of the water, of the storage. They ultimately have to respond, but they have a little more time to do it being below the major reservoirs. So the challenge from the Department of Interior back in 2013 was, if the current dry conditions were to continue, do you have a plan in place to address it? The answer at that time was no, and I think today the answer is yes. In the Lower Basin, you heard they're making very significant progress. It's not a done deal. There's going to be a lot of painful discussions, but they are making great progress on that. In the Upper Basin, we're making progress as well. The solutions in the Upper Basin are augmentation, that's cloud seeding, that's ongoing, extended or drought operations of the Colorado River Storage Project reservoirs, and demand management. When I say what's drought operations of these reservoirs, we always talk about how much water's in Lake Powell and Lake Mead, but for the Upper Basin, we have 3 other storage units that were built by the Colorado River Storage Project Act that operate in the same way, or legally they have the same purpose as Lake Powell, and those are Flaming Gorge on the border between Utah and Wyoming on the Green River system, the Aspinall unit here in western Colorado on the Gunnison, and Navajo Reservoir on the main stem of the San Juan. The dam and most of the water is in New Mexico, but it does actually back up water into Colorado. So those 3 reservoirs are available. Some of them have local purposes, but those 3 reservoirs essentially have the same main purpose as Lake Powell, which is to to re-regulate the river to allow the Upper Basin States to meet their obligations to the Lower Basin States. We've never had to use Flaming Gorge in that manner. We've never had to use Aspinall in that manner. We've never had to use Navajo. But what we're looking at is, if we're going to maintain critically storage levels in Lake Powell, the first thing we're going to do is look at those upstream reservoirs. Flaming Gorge, of course, has almost 4 million acre-feet, and move that water downstream. The states, the Department of Interior agencies are talking about that right now. We've been just talking about it and discussing it and modeling it for a number of years. And my prediction is that we will have an MOA at least ready to sign by December of this year. Whether it's actually executed or not is another question. I think it's going to be related to what's happening in the Lower Basin in Mexico and those kinds of things. But essentially, we're 99% there in understanding how we're going to do it. Here's a little bit, and I want to go into this and talk a little about ultimately what we're doing in Colorado in our risk study. But this is one of the best graphs, I think, if you can describe the history of the Colorado River. John Fleck, who spoke here last year, who now works for us as a consultant on some communications issues, put this together. But you can see total storage in Lake Mead and Lake Powell in blue. Now, total storage before the early 1960s was only Lake Mead. You can see where the blue and the red line diverge. And the orange, orange line, let's call it orange, that is Lake Powell. And I want to point out there are several instances where we've had natural droughts. First is in the 1950s, and Powell didn't exist, but Lake Mead almost lost 12 million acre-feet of storage from the late 1952 to early 1956. That's fairly significant considering demands on the system in those days were very small compared to what they were, we were using about 2.5 million acre-feet in the Upper Basin, not 4.5. In the Lower Basin, even California was not using 4.4 at the time, and Arizona was using about 1 million. So demands were about half of what they were today in the 1950s, yet a drought caused Lake Mead to drop in 3 years nearly 12 million acre-feet. If that drought were to occur again, it almost has the same impacts on the Upper Basin as does the 2000 to 2004. Then again, you can see, looking forward to look at 1982, the system was full. I mean, it was, we were putting flashboards on the top of Lake Powell to keep extra water in to avoid using the spillways. And then in the late 1980s, we went into the 1988 to 1994 dry period. And you can see there was this fairly substantial reduction in total storage. Recovered again in the 90s. It would have gone up to 50 million acre-feet had we let it, but we now are a little smarter about how we operate Powell. So we're not going to let Powell fill to the point where you might have to use those emergency spillways and wash these boulders the size of this building down into the river. So, basically we had a full system. We had a full system going into the 2000 drought. 2000 to 2004, you can see, is the very large drawdown. And really since 2005, we've had average conditions in the Upper Basin. It is true to say that if you look at hydrology from 2000 to 2016, it's been below average, but you can split that into two sub-periods. One is 2000 to 2004, where it was very below average, and another, which is 2005 through today, which is really about average conditions. In fact, Lake Powell has about 3 million acre-feet more storage in it today than it did 11 years ago in 2005 at this time. A little bit, as we were moving forward and discussing the contingency planning in Colorado, drought operations, demand management, we've gone out, we've talked to our roundtables, we've talked to a number of folks, and it raised a lot of questions about that final one, which is demand management. So we move the water we can from the upper reservoirs down to Powell, and there's still a shortage. What do we do? Well, we're referring to that as demand management. It's another way to say we're going to have to cut back our consumptive uses. So the West Slope roundtables with cooperation and I think good support and good participation by the East Slope folks, we took a much more detailed look at what would that mean for Colorado. So the questions that we looked at in the risk study was what are the magnitude and duration of shortages where we drop Powell below 35.25? What's the magic of 35.25? Well, it's about 6 million acre-feet in storage. It's about 2 million acre-feet above minimum power. If we allow Powell to go below minimum power, then a couple of things happen. You lose a significant source of revenues, but you also only cannot deliver water through the power plants. You can only deliver it through the outlet works. And as the reservoir continues to drop, those outlet works are constrained in their capacity because of the head behind them goes down, and all of a sudden the Upper Basin can't meet its obligations under the 2007 guidelines. We heard the structural deficit saying, well, if we deliver 9, well, if you allow minimum Powell to go below minimum power, you have two choices. Deliver what you can by opening the outlet works and letting whatever runs through run through based on the head, or taking out the dam. And I don't think anybody in here is going to suggest we take out the dam. So the point is that sets us up in a situation where we can't meet those downstream obligations. And if we can't meet the downstream obligations under the interim guidelines, the concern is we potentially, and I want to say potentially, have a compact problem. The interim guidelines are designed, as long as there's water in Lake Powell, we can meet our obligations under the interim guidelines. As long as we meet the obligations under the interim guidelines, there's no question we can meet our compact obligations. So it's a cascading thing. It's like always having a reserve in your family budget for emergencies. That's the 35-25 is about 2 to 6 million acre feet of reserves, if you want to call it, for those super dry conditions. So we wanted to look at, given that's a target, that's a management target, how much water would it take beyond the upstream reservoirs? How much real cutbacks would it take to keep that target in place? And with that, we proceeded with the study. We've had great participation, like I say, from all of the roundtables and from the East Slope. And we've had a rather interesting dialogue, a number of meetings. We sort of underestimated the number of meetings we were going to have by a factor of, I think, about 4 or 5. But we'll know better for the next phase. Just what we found there is risk is a function of hydrology, and I'll go through these quickly because they're pretty obvious. The drier the conditions, the more the risk. And here we showed three different hydrologic assumptions. At the bottom is the long-term period of record. And you can see without any action, okay, without any action, the lower basin's not going to implement their plan. You're going to just operate blindly pursuant to the interim guidelines, which there will be some shortages. We're not going to do anything in the upper basin. What's the risk of dropping below that 35-25 target? And this is out over time, and this is long-term hydrology. I'll go into that. It's not the stress test. It's not assuming the recent drought. And that risk goes up to about 10%, hangs in that 10% range, and then ultimately goes up to about 30% as we continue to grow. Climate change is in green, and then the 25-year, what we're calling the 25-year modeling test or stress test hydrology, which is 1988 to 2012, is in blue. And you can see the green and the blue sort of overlap each other. So using 1988 to 2012 is a good proxy for at least the previous generation of climate change hydrology. And it shows a very substantial risk. If we do nothing and we keep that hydrology that we've seen for the last 25 years, if that continues out into the future, the risk of going below 35-25 is well over 30% in many years and as high as 50%. That's unacceptable. That's too much risk. So we need to look at what happens when we actually take corrective action. So it's also a function of demands. The higher the demands in the upper basin, the higher the risk. And I will simply say that we used some information from the recent 2012 basin study, and we actually corrected one of their low growth demands, which was called D1, and we reduced it by 10%. Reducing it by 10% actually replicates what the upper basin has been using within the last 20 years within a few percentage points. So that's the lower red line. The higher growth scenarios are shown in the upper lines there. That's Schedule A and Schedule D1 uncorrected. Now here's some of the results. Assuming the lower basin is successful in implementing what Suzanne showed us, that they successfully reduce their demands by over 1.2 million acre feet, which is a combination of the Tier 3 shortage and the additional measures they're taking. Includes Mexico, includes the United States. Assuming they're successful, and I think they will be, assuming we move that water from upstream reservoirs down into Powell, how much more water would it take in terms of demand management? How much more water would it take in terms of us cutting back our consumptive uses in the upper basin as a whole to keep that 35-25 target? And there, look at the green lines, that's the current demands, and you can see, and this is out over, there were about 500 years in the record, so if you say out of those 500 model years, there were 8 occurrences of a 500 to 1,000 to 1 million acre foot shortage. There were 6 occurrences between 100 and 500,000. And then there are a couple of really big ones, over 1 million acre-feet, and one that's between 1.5 million and 2 million. That's very significant. So we wanted to mine into the details and find, well, what happens there? And and what we found is that given where we are today with about 13 million acre-feet in storage, if we were to go into one of those very severe droughts, 52 to 56 or 2000 to 2004, we basically, hydrology overwhelms what's happening in the Upper Basin, and we've got to come up with big demands. And I personally think that we're not going to be able to come up with that much water unless we look at some alternative strategies like banking a little bit of water each year. It's inconceivable to me that you could come up with 1 million acre-feet in a year or even 2 years. We might come up with 1 million acre-feet, put it in a reservoir if we put it in at 100,000 acre-feet at a time. So we're going to be looking at those alternative strategies. But the conclusions, pretty obvious: hydrology demands and development levels matter. Contingency planning is essential. And remember, it's only those really bad years. We solve the problems for many smaller droughts, for many shorter duration, less intense droughts with drought operations only. We solve a lot more with drought operations and small demand management cutbacks. But those big ones, we still have to work on. So again, some of the demand management volumes we are seeing in the model are very large and may not be feasible, so we need to consider the trade-offs and alternative strategies, including accepting the risk. There's no such thing as zero risk in hydrology. Nature doesn't work that way. So at what point in time is the cost of implementing a demand management program, both the political and the economic cost, at what point does that exceed the incremental benefit of trying to have a program that covers the worst potential situation? And that's a policy decision, and I think they're talking about those same things in the Lower Basin. There is going to be some risk here. So I want to also talk about, and just mention, and then go into questions. During the presentations, we had a number of frequently asked questions. And what we found is the primary value of phase 1 of the study has been educational. And a lot of our roundtable members who are in the water business really didn't understand how Lake Powell operated, didn't understand the function of Lake Powell. So there were a number of questions. How is Lake Powell operated? Why is Powell releasing 9 million acre-feet this water year? Likely 9 million acre-feet next water year. 9 million acre-feet 2 years ago. And if I had to put any money on it, I would say you were probably going to release 9 million acre-feet in at least 2018 as well. Why are we releasing 9 million acre-feet when the lower basins, our obligation under the compact, it might be less than that? And I'll go into that here. And the reason is, under the interim guidelines, Powell and Mead are operated in a coordinated way. So we set up tiers in Lake Powell. Now, the intent of the 2007 guidelines was to preserve a minimum objective release in Lake Powell of about 8.25 million acre-feet. That came out of a process that was developed in the late 60s and 70s. And I have a paper on it and go into some of the more gory details. That committee was called the Committee on Probabilities and Test Studies. I wonder who invented that name. But anyway, it set the 8.25. And in the paper, I basically say that the way we arrived at that decision as a basin was very similar to the way we've arrived at many other decisions. And it was the only decision that the states could disagree with and accept at the same time, because the only alternative to not accepting it was going to court, and nobody wanted to take the risk, and it's a huge risk, if you go to court and let the court decide which way. So nobody got what they wanted, but everybody got something they could live with. And that's been the value, in my view, of the 1922 Compact. It set up a series of decisions where the states have got together and have decided we have to live with the framework, if you want to call it, of the Compact. So we've got to make some decisions. And those decisions, we're not going to get what we want, but we're not going to push ourselves over the cliff either. And I think we have a number many more of those decisions facing us. But anyway, so Powell is operated by consensus of the states. The states agreed in 2006 to the interim guidelines. The Secretary implemented it through a record of decision, and Lake Powell and Lake Mead are operated in an interim, in an interim way up through 2026, actually 2025, but it'll cover the 2026 year, and they're operated in a coordinated way. So if there's a little extra water in Powell and a little less water in Lake Mead, like right now we have 13 million acre-feet in Powell and 9.6 in Lake Mead, and we're in a tier such that we're going to deliver 9 million acre-feet. Now, that doesn't mean 3 years from now it could be 9. 3 years from now it could be 7, 4, 8. So the idea was there would be a few more years. It's 8.25, if you want to call it, is the fulcrum of the teeter-totter. There's going to be a few years that it's going to be 9. There's going to be a few years when it's going to be 7, 4, 8. But we're going to keep the system in balance. So that was sort of the political, I would say, the political compromise with the interim guidelines. It's just my prediction, and I can make this prediction, I'm retiring in a few years, is that we're not going to change that in 2026. We can tweak the interim guidelines, but once you tweak the interim guidelines too far, you end up in a situation where once that you're on that teeter-totter and somebody jumps off or something, it's not going to happen. It's going to end up in the court, and nobody wins if you end up in court. So the reality is that getting 8 parties, 7 states, the Department of Interior, maybe even Mexico by then, so maybe 9 parties to agree to a change is going to be incremental, and those interim guidelines will continue in an interim way with some tweaks, maybe slightly different tiers, maybe more tiers, those kinds of things. But the fundamental system of moving water from the upper basin to the lower basin, meeting Mexico, meeting the 75/10, those kind of things are going to continue in a series of interim guidelines well on into the future. So I wanted to just one more thing in terms of during this, we always heard, is this real or is this just a paper study? We in the water business, especially in Colorado, we're driven by paper studies. Firm yield, okay, every year to Denver Water is 1954, 55, or 56. And if they're going to do something, they want to know what it's going to do to their yield in 1954 through 1956 because they set their tap policy. In other words, they set how many customers they can serve based on the criteria that they've established on their system through that critically dry period. Well, our critical period right now is 2004. And if we start with less than 15 or 16 million acre-feet of water in Lake Powell, and we were to go through another 2000 to 2004, we essentially drained Lake Powell without action. With action, we're going to probably take it below that 35-25 target, but we can probably stay above 34-90. So the question that comes up is, what if we have a drought that's worse? Well, then we're going to have to adapt. We're just going to have to do something more. Finally, I want to address this and there's been some criticism of our study in that we picked the period, John Caron's in the audience here and some others, Jim Lockhead. We said, well, how are we going to analyze this from the upper basin? We picked the hydrologic period 1988 to 2012. We sort of labeled it a stress test period. Up until that time, the Bureau of Reclamation only wanted to operate the CRSS model beginning in 1906 and ending in 2012, and they just couldn't figure out how to, they knew they could do it with the model, but policy-wise, they couldn't figure out how to split it up into shorter tiers. Well, we split it up for them. We did 1988 to 2012, and the reason is it replicated as much as we could the recent drought, and it provided a wet period because we wanted to see what happened to reservoirs in recovery. And the late 1990s were very wet. So that 2000 to 2012 stress period has a mean flow at Lee Ferry, a natural flow of about 13.3 million. 2000 to 2016 is about 12.5. So you can see it's slightly optimistic based on what we've seen recently. If you go to the long-term hydrology, 1950 to 2012, it's about 14. And then getting at a question that Kevin McBride asked, well, what about tree ring data? We know from tree ring studies that period of about 1120 to about 1170, which was 50 years. They had an estimated natural flow at leaf area of about 12.7, which is not a lot different than what we've seen today. So that 16-year or 17-year drought period that's kind of a teenager about ready to leave high school and enter college under the 1100s drought could be somebody well into their middle-aged years. So with that, I want to leave some time for questions, and I want to point out that the risk study is not over. We're going to take it to the next step. We are scoping what we're going to do in the next phase. But among the things we've got to do is resume the framework discussions under the Colorado Plan, look at demand management. How would it actually occur? What's the role of organizations like the Colorado River District, the Southwestern District, the CWCB, the Upper Colorado River Commission? We haven't had those discussions. And then we also need to identify and analyze trade-offs associated with risks and rewards. And we just can't assume that we're going to put in place a system that covers 100% of a paper risk, because it may be impossible or politically impossible, even if we could accomplish it on paper. So with that, questions, thoughts, comments, some things to throw at me?
Anybody with questions, please come up. We'll get the mics turned on. Eric, while people are queuing up, from an Upper Basin perspective, we've heard the Lower Basin, we've heard some heroic efforts and some dramatic plans for future conservation. From the Upper Basin's perspective, you've talked about the need for demand management, but isn't that need created by the Lower Basin's overuse and poor accounting practices of not allocating evaporation to the Lower Basin?
Yeah, it would be, the question is, isn't the problems on the Upper Basin because of the Lower Basin, to put it simply? That would be wonderful, but the answer is no, it's not. The problems up here are aggravated by the structural deficit, by overuse in the Lower Basin, but they're working on that. And when we looked at how much our shortages might be, we assumed they were 100% successful in implementing their Lower Basin conservation plan. And even when they have done that in the Lower Basin, we have problems in the Upper Basin. It's because we're above the reservoirs. And in those last years of a 2000 to 2004 drought, we really have very little inflow into the reservoirs, and we've got to live through it. So the Upper Basin has an independent problem that is made better through conservation in the Lower Basin. The Lower Basin has a structural deficit that's made better through operations and the contingency plan in the Upper Basin. But neither side can blame the other for the problems they're in. It is a basin after all. Yes, sir.
Eric, it's me, it's Jim.
Oh.
I'm not a sir.
The lights don't, you have the same color hair as I do. That's all I can tell.
Yeah, I can't see it either. So my question is about risk tolerance. And there was a joint board meeting yesterday with the Southwest and the River District, and I heard one of our board members say, darn right, we don't want to have any risk. That was Mark Catlin, our opening speaker. But then there was discussion that there could be those in other parts of the state that are willing to accept the risk. So talk to us about risk tolerance.
Yeah, the question of risk tolerance, and it's a new discussion for the river, and it's a new discussion for the Colorado River Basin. The problem that we have with risk tolerance is we've got to understand that there are some entities that have very little tolerance for risk because they serve people, and you can turn off lawns in Colorado Springs and Denver Water, but you cannot, as a safety matter, remove a water supply for a metro area that has 4 million people. It's just it's just not going to happen. So at some point, we got to recognize that there are entities that serve municipal water in both Upper Basin and Lower Basin that cannot accept a minimum, all the risk. And the concern is if that risk tolerance is too high, if we say we're going to just do 100,000 acre-feet per year in conservation occasionally, and we're not going to impact this, and we have a 2000 to 2004 drought, and you put a utility that has to serve water in a situation of going out and taking extreme measures like condemning agricultural rights, which they can do under Colorado law in order to improve their water supply. So it's a balance between recognizing the consequences of not having a contingency plan in action and the recognition that there isn't a governor in any state of any party, of any gender, of anything that's going to turn off water to people, especially big cities. You know, if you got a town of 100, you can send them bottles of water, but you're not going to meet the needs of the city of Colorado Springs with bottled water.
Eric, early in your presentation, you identified a third strategy of the contingency plan, and that is increasing supply primarily through
Augmentation, right.
augmentation or cloud seeding. Although I haven't heard anything about cloud seeding in months. Could you give us an update? What's happening to increase our capacity with cloud seeding?
We are continuing to invest in cloud seeding in basin-wide level. There is, I will say, Wyoming completed a very detailed study with NCAR on that. To say the study was inconclusive is probably correct. There is some hope that those cloud seeding numbers will give us increase our supplies by up to 5%. But we also need to recognize that the kinds of years where cloud seeding works is not the dry years. If they work, they're going to work when there's clouds, and that's going to be in wetter years. And we in western Colorado have a little problem in that if you already have too much snow in Steamboat Springs, and you're tired of you're tired of going out and climbing over a 10-foot pile of snow to get to your car, the last thing you want to hear about is more cloud seeding. Well, and that's kind of the best year to do it. So we are working on that. It hasn't gone away. There is continuing investment in cloud seeding. The River District that you were a board member on is kind of taking in an umbrella contract to sort of administer some of the state programs with the CWCB. But I do not see it as a savior. If anything, it's already in the system. It's already in the hydrology. Then other actions, there's other actions as well, like phreatophyte control, and those are ongoing as well. So I think that's the last question. I want to turn it over to the next panel, and thank you for your time.